Good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Savitas. I'm a cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy here in London. On behalf of the U.S. Embassy, I'd like to thank everybody for connecting with us tonight. I know Zoom fatigue is something that's kind of plagued us all over the last year, but the team at Education USA has put together a really fantastic schedule for you all to highlight women's colleges in the United States. The first speaker that we have, I'd like to introduce is Professor Dorothy Moseby from Mount Holyoke College. She's the interim dean of faculty and vice president for academic affairs, and also the Mary E. Woolley Professor of Spanish. Professor Moseby is a specialist in Afro-Hispanic literature and culture and Caribbean and African diaspora literature. She's also an accomplished author, having published a book, Place, Language, and Identity in Afro-Costa Rican Literature. And she's also a published poet with works that have appeared in the Hispanic Cultural Review. She is taught both African and Hispanic literature, as well as at Mount Holyoke and at The Ohio State University. Professor Moseby is a graduate of both the Universities of Missouri at Columbia and Hood College, where she earned her undergraduate degree. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Moseby, who's going to talk about the import and relations with women's colleges. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's wonderful to be here with you all this evening. So thank you again, and I'm really pleased to share my love of women's colleges. I am a product of a women's college, and I've spent the past 18 years of my career teaching and working at a women's college, and I am very committed to the way that women's colleges in the United States transform women's lives. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is just a brief overview of some of the things I'm going to touch on in this very brief presentation. So why a women's college? A brief history of women's colleges in the United States and how women's colleges prepare students for the 21st century or for 21st century challenges. Next slide, please. So why choose to study at a women's college? Well, first, women's colleges are rigorous and relevant. There are so many advantages to learning among a group of highly motivated and intellectually curious students from all over the world. And we've seen in recent years and in the news not too long ago, just an increase in acts of misogyny in the public and private spheres. And that means that women's colleges are still needed now more than ever to prepare the next generation of women leaders to be agents of change. In the United States, we noticed in 2017 that women's colleges and also historically Black colleges and universities saw a significant increase in applications, and those applications to our institutions continue to rise. There's also the legacy of leadership. Women's colleges challenge students to step outside of gender norms and imagine what is possible in terms of developing as leaders. Students at women's colleges hold all of the offices in student government and also other campus leadership positions, including clubs and peer education programs. It is here where students have the chance to deepen their skills and to lead others in achieving common goals. Also, opportunity. Students at women's colleges have access to opportunities that co-ed institutions may not have or may not encourage women's participation. They also have access to a global network of highly educated women in key positions in the field, in many fields and industries. And this goes to the global alumni network, which is especially strong at women's colleges. 80% of women's college graduates are strong supporters of their alma mater, including serving as trustees, mentoring students, providing internships, and also recruiting students from their alma mater into their fields and industries. We had a wonderful example, and I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to bring up Mount Holyoke as an example, but I know that there are numerous examples from women's colleges across the country. But recently we had an event that featured the former mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, Carmen Julene Cruz, in conversation with Ayanna Pressley, a member of Congress from Massachusetts. And this exchange was made possible through an alum of our college. And so Harriet Weissman made a generous gift to the college to make this happen. And her name is also on our Weissman Center for Leadership, along with her husband, Paul, which really demonstrates the commitment that our alumni have to supporting women's education for many, many generations. Next slide, please. So there was a time when women were barred from traditionally male-dominated institutions, and women's colleges were among the few where women could receive an education on the same level as male institutions. Now, women have many more options to choose from, but still there is something very special about the history and legacy of women's colleges. So we see that Harvard was established in 1636, but we don't see the foundation of a women's college until several hundred years later in 1836 with Wesleyan College, which is still a women's college in Macon, Georgia. We also have the critical foundation of the Seven Sisters. And so Mount Holyoke College is the first of the Seven Sisters. And these are women's colleges that were established to offer a rigorous education for women on the same level as the Ivy League colleges. So colleges like Harvard and Brown, Princeton, Yale, Dartmouth, Penn, and Cornell, because these male institutions did not admit women for their degree programs. So Mount Holyoke was founded in 1837 by Mary Lyon. And Mary Lyon was a chemist, and she was committed to educating young women of modest means. And so that is a tradition that we carry forward as being the first of the Seven Sisters. Today, there are about 50 women's colleges in the United States. And I believe at the high point of women's colleges in the country, there are over 200. And so we do have a lasting legacy, and it's really important that we continue to maintain and support women's colleges as institutions. Women's colleges have offered many firsts. We have a history of firsts. The list of firsts among graduates of women's colleges is quite long and spans a number of fields and disciplines and industries. For example, Hillary Clinton was the first woman nominated by a major party for president, and she graduated from Wellesley. Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman to represent a major political party as a vice presidential candidate. Katharine Graham, the first CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Nancy Pelosi, first woman Speaker of the House. Madeleine Albright, the first woman Secretary of State. The first woman to be ordained in the Presbyterian Church. The first woman to serve as general in the US Army. The first woman to receive a Nobel Peace Prize. And also the first woman to lead Harvard University. Were all graduates of women's colleges. Women's colleges are groundbreaking and inclusive, and there's a history of activism associated with our institutions. And so the photos in the slide demonstrate the participation of women from women's colleges in the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century, and also in the women's rights movement in the 1960s and 70s in the United States. Next slide, please. So this is just a slide of the Seven Sisters, and now we call ourselves the Seven Siblings because Vassar College is co-ed. Vassar went co-ed, I believe, in 1969. So we have Mount Holyoke, established in 1837 in Massachusetts, Vassar, 1865 in New York, Wellesley, 1875 in Massachusetts, Smith, 1875 Massachusetts, Radcliffe, which is now part of Harvard University as an institute and no longer a standalone institution, 1879 in Massachusetts, Bryn Mawr, 1885 in Pennsylvania, and Barnard, 1889 in New York. And so you see here the lasting legacy and history of our institutions. Next slide, please. And here's just a list of a small tip of the iceberg of the many women who have graduated from women's colleges who have really transformed the world. And so I have images of a couple people that have been in the news lately. One is Chloe Zhao, a graduate from Mount Holyoke College, who's the director of the film Nomadland, which is a great film and highly recommended. And then Susan Laurie Parks, also a graduate of Mount Holyoke. You can see my bias here. Also a graduate of Mount Holyoke College, who wrote the screenplay for the film The United States versus Billie Holiday. And I believe she also participated in the creation of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom as well. Zora Neale Hurston in the center below, and actually going back to the top, Virginia Apgar. So she graduated from Mount Holyoke College, and she is the creator of the Apgar scale. So when newborns are born, their health and vitality is assessed using the Apgar scale. Frances Perkins, who is one of my sheroes, first woman on the cabinet under the Roosevelt administration. Zora Neale Hurston, a graduate of Barnard College, a fabulous African-American pioneer and writer. And Barbara Smith, graduate of Mount Holyoke College and a real founder of the Black feminist movement and concepts of Black feminism. Next slide, please. So women's colleges today and outcomes for the 21st century. So women who graduate from women's colleges are more likely to graduate in 4 years, more likely to complete a graduate degree, and more likely to develop critical skills, especially leadership, forming written arguments, and public speaking. And the images that I have to the right are of a Mount Holyoke graduate, Ellen Chilemba, who founded an important non-governmental organization in her home country of Malawi. So women who make a difference in the world. Next slide, please. So leadership, I love this photo, which is of our Mount Holyoke debate team. Although 2% of the women who graduate from college attended a women's college, graduates of women's colleges make up 33% of the women on Fortune 1000 boards, 30% of a Business Week list of rising stars in corporate America, and 20% of women in the United States Congress. Next slide, please. Women in STEM. So one thing I'll mention is that students at women's colleges are 1.5 more likely to major in math, science, or pre-med. 30 to 40% of students at elite women's colleges major in STEM. In the case of Mount Holyoke, 35% of our students are majoring in STEM. Women's colleges graduate in STEM at a higher rate than the national average, and 9% of Bryn Mawr College students majored in math compared to a national average of 1% in co-ed institutions. Next slide, please. One thing I'll also mention is that, thinking about STEM at Mount Holyoke. Mount Holyoke was founded by, as I mentioned earlier, by a woman who was a chemist. And so one of the things that we really strive to do at our institution is how do we achieve gender equity in the STEM fields? So one thing I'll mention, I'll continue to toot Mount Holyoke's horn for a little bit, is that among all the baccalaureate institutions in the United States over the past 50 years, Mount Holyoke launches the greatest number of women who go on to earn doctorates in science, technology, engineering, and math year after year. And I would dare to say that this is a pattern for women's colleges across the United States. For graduate education, about 75% 75% of women's college graduates are in the workforce, and over 80% have earned advanced degrees. And women's college graduates are twice as likely as female graduates of co-ed institutions to earn a PhD, attend medical school, be involved in philanthropic activities, attain higher positions in their career, and earn higher incomes. Women's colleges produce disproportionately high numbers of alumni who go into male-dominated fields such as STEM, business, medicine, law, and politics. Next slide, please. Diversity. So I chose a headline from an article that appeared a number of years ago. Surprise, the colleges that aren't mostly white are mostly women. And this holds true for women's colleges, so many women's colleges across the United States. So I just put up some numbers of, the students, white students, students of color, and also international students. But I also put forward a couple of images on the right as well, as our colleges are also gender diverse in terms of accepting the gender diversity, because it is part and soul of inclusion, and also our belief in feminism and our belief in all women and being able to serve all women. So the poster, one of the posters says, Smith College can't be a women's college without supporting trans women. And so this is true at Mount Holyoke, which we became a trans affirming and gender inclusive college in 2014, and a number of our other 7 sister colleges and other women's colleges have followed suit in terms of being gender inclusive and respecting and honoring the gender diversity among our student, staff, and also faculty bodies. Next slide, please. So I just want to finish with a few images from the College of Students in Action. So this is our Thimble Makerspace and Innovation Lab, where a lot of science and creativity come together. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And the next one, please. And the next. And we'll finish with a view of the library where so much magic happens. So I will end here, and I welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Moseby, for that wonderful insight and introduction to women's colleges in the US. I know I've come away learning something new and also feeling very empowered, and you're really making me wish I had attended a women's college myself. If anyone does have questions for Professor Moseby, if you want to drop those in the Q&A, and what we'll do is at the end, we'll welcome all our speakers back up to take your questions. In just a moment, we are going to hear from 2 British women in the US, one who is a current student at a women's college and another who has just recently graduated from a women's college, to get that real perspective into what it's like to be an international student at a women's college from that side of things. But before we jump into that, I'd like to quickly take a moment to introduce myself and to introduce EducationUSA and our services and how we might be able to support you in your journey to applying and potentially ultimately studying at a university in the US. So my name is Holly Haig, and I am one of 2 EducationUSA advisors here at the US-UK Fulbright Commission. Now, EducationUSA is part of a global network of advisors around the world. I think there are around 400 centres and around 600 of us advisors working to serve international students in their pursuit of studying in the US. So we are the only official source of US study information here in the UK, and we provide free, up-to-date, non-biased information about the US admissions process. So if it is your dream to go over to the US and study, that is what we are here to help with, and we are more than welcome to support you one-to-one via email or phone, as well as through our advising events like these. that's enough from me. And so I'm now going to invite Carla Melaco to come up and screen and introduce herself. Carla is originally from Tyneside here in the UK and currently in her final year at Barnard College in New York.
Hi everyone, firstly just thank you all for being here and thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to speak a little bit about my experiences in the US and also specifically at a women's college in the US, because I think it's been such an important part of my educational experiences so far. And yeah, I'm really excited to share that with you all. So a little bit of background about me before I start. I am from Newcastle in the UK. I studied maths, English literature, French and Spanish at A-level, and I am currently a senior at Barnard College. So right now I am based in New York. I major in French translation and literature. And I think one of the really important things for me about the US university system was the broadness of education you can have. So for instance, for me, my minors are in dance, Spanish and psychology. So you can see just a little bit there, the kind of broad experiences I've had in my educational experiences so far. So a little bit about why I applied to Barnard. I applied to Barnard early decision. So I applied in the fall of 2016. And honestly, the women's college experience wasn't a big part of why I applied to Barnard. It was more an afterthought for me. So I applied to Barnard, one, because it's based in New York, and I knew if I was going to come to the US, I wanted to go to what is, in my opinion, you know, the biggest city in the US. Another thing is that Barnard has a really strong dance department, and as someone who was a dancer growing up through high school, that was something that I really wanted to see in a college experience, and was also something that attracted me to the US, to have that kind of diversity in experiences. And Barnard has a really robust dance department, so I really wanted to be part of that. And then the last thing that was really important for me was the community aspect of Barnard. So one thing about US colleges, I think, over UK universities is that each university and each campus very much has its own character, its own kind of students, its own vibe on campus. And I remember watching a video that the Res Life team at Barnard had put up on the YouTube channel, and just seeing the students interact in the way that they were in the dorms, seeing the kind of diversity between students was something that straight away just clicked for me, and I knew that that was the place that I wanted to spend the next 4 years. And so that night I told my mum that that was the university I wanted to apply to. I applied there, thankfully got in early decision. And so then fast forward 1 year, I was a freshman at Barnard. I thought I wanted to major in some combination of French, Spanish and dance, but wasn't sure what that would look like. So in my freshman summer of Barnard, I did a program in Paris that was really influential to me. Educationally, I decided my major was in translation and theatre, which is something that I still carry with me today. I also met one of my closest friends on the program. I had a wonderful time on a fully funded program in Paris with Barnard. I also met one of my advisors who I still work with today and I still feel really close with. And then following that experience, my advisor had me interview with the French embassy in New York. And so that I then got an internship out of that. And in my sophomore year, I worked with the French embassy in New York over the summer. And then fast forward to junior year, I was then, I'd been part of an organization called Build On, which is an educational nonprofit that works at Barnard and also at Columbia University. And so with them, one of the experiences I got to do with them was I went to Nepal for an educational visit, and then again to Senegal. And my family history, we come from West Africa originally, so that was a really influential part of my experience. And one of the most memorable experiences I had on that program was I was with a group of Barnard students. There were about 5 of us in total, and we were having conversations about gender diversity and gender equity, and just having that kind of relationship with people who came from a very different, they came from a rural background in Senegal. So having those kind of conversations was really fascinating, and I think particularly to have those kind of conversations with other Barnard students, other students who had come to this women's college experience was really important for me, and something that I still hold dear to me today. And And then so following on from that, it was junior year, obviously the coronavirus had hit. And so the pandemic kind of threw a little bit of complications in the works, but Barnard was really supportive throughout the whole time. I actually then did a fellowship with the Columbia Business School in social enterprise over my junior summer. And so I partnered with an organization that's based in Boston, but works internationally in environmental peace building. And so I worked with them, I still work with them now, and following graduation, we'll be joining them again this summer. So I'm really excited for that. And again, actually, one thing that happened that was really interesting on that program was that it was another Women's College alum who actually interviewed for me for the program. And so having that kind of relationship with her throughout my time at Peace Rising was really important. And so, yeah, right now I am working with them again on their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And I think something that's underpinned my entire time at Barnard, and something that really characterizes the experience at a women's college, is that you have these kind of conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion. You see representation, so you see yourself represented in the leaders that you go to. When you go to a dean, you see someone who identifies in a similar way to you, who is also a woman. And so I think that's been, for me, a really important part of my time at Barnard and my time at a women's college. So I would really encourage you all to consider the benefits of a women's college as you embark on applications to US universities.
Great, thank you so much, Carla. And I think a lot of what you're saying there is just so interesting to hear, not only how your time at Barnard has really allowed you to take advantage of the sort of liberal arts curriculum and some of those extracurricular activities you've been able to immerse yourself in, but also that idea of really strong alumni networks that come with women's colleges. Speaking of alumni, we are now going to hand over to Phoebe Cribb, who is a recent graduate of Bryn Mawr College, to share a little bit about her experiences of studying at women's college and what she's up to now.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, everyone. I'm super excited to talk about my experiences at a women's college. So I am from Chorley, Lancashire originally, and I was on the Interest US program as part of cohort 4. And very similar to Carla, when I was deciding which colleges I wanted to apply to, I wasn't very intentional about choosing a women's college. It kind of just so happened that every college that was on my list just so happened to be a women's college because it had all the things that I wanted. I wanted to be in or near a city. I wanted to go to a small liberal arts college because, like Carla, I also wanted to have more of a broad academic experience than I'd had in the UK. And I also wanted to be connected to other colleges. And I think that's something important about women's colleges, is that there are often ties to other colleges in the region. So for me, I was able to take classes at Haverford College, Swarthmore College, and the University of Pennsylvania. But at the same time, I was still part of this small, close-knit community. So I kind of got the best of both worlds. And that's the case for a lot of women's colleges. And since being at Bryn Mawr, I graduated last year, and I got to do some really incredible things over my 4 years. I worked for the Civic Engagement Office as their service and outreach coordinator. So I got to work with local nonprofits in the Philadelphia region. Bryn Mawr's in the suburb of West Philadelphia. And so I got to work on a volunteer program. I also got to organize students to go to several protests. I got students to go to the first ever Women's March in DC, the March for Our Lives, some really cool activism things over the course of the 4 years. I was also a student consultant with the Teaching and Learning Institute, which is a joint department between Bryn Mawr and Haverford that help professors with their teaching practices. And so I did a lot of work on diversity and inclusion in the STEM field. I also studied abroad at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and that was a great experience. And I also got to do, like Carla mentioned, a lot of internship opportunities. I did an internship in Washington, DC, where I worked with a think tank on federal policy research. And that was an unpaid internship, but Bryn Mawr actually gave me a scholarship so I could fund my time there. And since graduating last year during the pandemic, which was a little strange, but I moved to Florida and I worked on a voter education campaign for the presidential election. And that was really awesome because I got to work with some colleges down in Florida. And now I'm working as a policy intern for a government consulting firm in their national security and defense team. And something that I just want to say about my time at women's colleges, and something that I think was the most important thing that I got out of it, was just having the confidence within myself, within my academics, and being able to kind of hold my own in any male-dominated room. Being in a classroom full of women, it's a sense of security and support that I'd never felt before, that really allowed me to dig deep into what I believe, what my opinions are, and how I articulate them. And being in the field of defense and national security, it's extremely intimidating and it's extremely male-dominated. And I don't know if I would be as successful if I had not gone to a women's college prior. And also, like Carla said, the network of women that you get access to is just incredible, not only from your own college, but also from Seven Sisters and beyond. And so I would, again, really encourage you all to look into women's colleges, even if you've never thought about it. Like me and Carla, we weren't very intentional, but it was the best decision that I could have made for myself. So happy to answer any questions and super excited for you all to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Phoebe. I'm now going to welcome Phoebe, Carla, and Professor Moseby back up on screen, if that's okay. And I would also encourage any attendees, if you have any questions for any of our three panelists this evening, to drop those in the Q&A box where we'll be able to see them. And we'll get started once we have a chance for everyone to put any comments in the Q&A. I first want to ask a question to both Phoebe and Carla that came out of both of your introductions. You both mentioned how your choice of attending a women's college wasn't necessarily so intentional at first. And so I wanted to ask, what were your processes like for finding your fit? What are the things were you thinking about then that led you towards, you know, a small liberal arts college or to a women's college? What were the things that were most important to you as you were engaged in your college search?
So I think one of the important things, and Phoebe mentioned this, is the location of the college. So, you know, deciding whether you want to be in a rural place, if you want to be in a big city, if you want to be close to a big city, that's a really important thing, because obviously the campus culture is going to be very different. Generally, if you're in a rural place, a lot of what you do is going to be on campus, whereas if you're in a city, you probably have a lot more opportunity to go out into the city and do other things, maybe have friends or social networks outside of just your campus setting. I think other things to think about are the education. You know, every college has a different education system. So for instance, at Barnard, we have certain distribution requirements. So everyone has to take a history class, a lab science, and that varies very much based on the university that you go to. That's another thing to think about. And then, like for me, I had a particular interest in dance, so I really wanted to go somewhere that had a strong dance department. So if you had a specific interest in, you could also choose based on that. And then I think the other thing is just the general, I guess the general identity of the college. So generally, I think women's colleges have this really strong emphasis on inclusion and diversity and equity and all of that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's very different. You know, some colleges will be really business oriented. So if that's something that you're interested in, then obviously you would be more likely to choose a college like that.
Yeah, and I think going off what Carla said, you also have to keep in mind that you're going to be living here for 4 years. So it's not just all about the academics, which are important. And I think I made this mistake of being overly focused on the academic opportunities, but also you've got to look at the location, the food, like what do students do for fun, opportunities to travel, are there airports nearby, and just thinking about the overall experience that you'll have, because if that doesn't match up with the academics, then you're not really going to have a good time there. So I would encourage everyone to speak to students who are actually at the college, because they're going to give you the best insight as to what it's actually like to be a student there.
Great. And I now have a question for Professor Moseby. Would you be able to speak to a little bit the position of women's colleges when it comes to postgraduate students. Perhaps if that's the transition from a women's college to the postgraduate level, is there an opportunity in the US to study at the postgraduate level at an all-female institution?
So yes, so there are a number of institutions that do have graduate level programs. The one that first comes to mind is Texas Women's University in Texas. And, that school has has full host of different types of degree programs at the master's and also PhD level. But there are also schools like Mary Baldwin. A number of the 7 siblings also offer master's degree programs, like we offer masters in education. And there are a number of others that also offer master's degrees, although our primary focus is on the bachelor's degree, but there are possibilities.
Great. I've seen a couple of questions coming up in the chat. I just encourage everyone, if you can send those to the Q&A box, just so that I'm able to see them all in one place, so I don't miss anyone's questions. A question has come up here for Phoebe and Carla about funding your education and how that process looked at your respective colleges. Professor Moseby, you might be able to contribute sort of an insight into what that looks like at Mount Holyoke. I imagine there will be quite a few similarities across the 3 colleges. I don't know if Phoebe, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I had a financial aid package, which was a mixture of a few things. The majority was just a very generous grant that I got from Bryn Mawr that I did not have to pay back. I also did work study, so I was employed by the college, and that's why I worked at the Civic Engagement Office. And that contributed to mainly my living expenses and travel and air tickets and things like that. And then I also had a small loan, it was quite small compared to what you would get in the UK. So it was a mixture of all of those things. And you do have to apply, and the conditions of international students are often different from US citizens. So I would encourage you to look into the fine print for each college.
Yeah, I was in a very similar situation to Phoebe, and that's actually something we didn't mention. Finding financial fit, but obviously that's really important. I think for us, we only looked at schools that had these strong financial aid packages that they gave to international students, but definitely it's something to look into, because as Phoebe said, sometimes the conditions of aid are different for international students compared to domestic students, or sometimes there's just no aid at all offered to international students. So that's definitely something to look into.
Yeah, I think Phoebe and Carla said it best, that it's often a mixture of grants and work study for international students. And each school has a different approach, but I really think that there is funding available, and the cost of, the sticker price of a US education or private school, education shouldn't be a factor to deter you from applying.
Absolutely. And if you do have further questions about funding, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at EducationUSA, and we'll definitely be able to provide you with some more resources around that. A really good question coming up in the chat. What things, I guess this is more of a question for Carla, what things did you take into consideration as a member of the BA/ME community? Did that factor into your decision about where it was that you chose to study? And I guess, Professor Moseby, if you could maybe give a bit of an insight into what resources and support networks there are for, minority students on campus at a women's college, that would be great.
Yeah, so one thing I would say about this, and I'm glad that you brought that question up, because I think women's colleges in particular are built on this foundation of equity. They're all based on making sure that education is accessible to everyone. And so I think that now in the current day has expanded out from just questions of gender to other kinds of equity too. And I think women's colleges in particular, I know Barnard for sure, has places an important impact on equity and diversity across the spectrum. And so for me, I think there's a lot of things that have been, I think questions of race are discussed differently, like the discourse around race is different in the UK to the US. But I'll give one example of straight when I came into Barnard. So I got accepted into Barnard, and straight away I was introduced to a program that was basically a pre-college program to go over to the US for a weekend and to be among other women of color in the US and who also had been accepted to Barnard. So that was, for me, straight away something that I don't think that I would have got from a UK university, and maybe even not from other universities that weren't women's colleges in the US. So I think that's one example of how questions of race and as a woman of color, you're going to be accepted in these schools, and there's definitely on Barnard's campus a strong push towards equity among students of color on campus.
So I'll connect on what Carla shared, that our institutions are founded on equity. The women were barred, and these were spaces that we wanted to welcome women, and over time we've been more inclusive of all women at our institutions. I think women's colleges, the conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion is a lot more advanced than it is at co-ed institutions in the United States. And I think the work that we're doing is also much more ahead of other institutions as well, in terms of the conversations that we're having about race, identity, gender inclusion, so much further than I would say that colleagues at other institutions are. And we've also built in supports. Now, none of the supports are perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect institution, but I think the supports that women's colleges have built in to support students of color and to support the different experiences that students of color are having, and also the different experiences that gender diverse students are having on our campuses. And so many of our campuses have a vice president for diversity, equity, inclusion, also called a chief diversity officer, who oversees and holds the institution accountable for doing the work as far as advancing belonging and inclusion and a feeling that all of our students belong on campus.
Thank you both for both the personal insight into that and sort of speaking more generally about some of those resources. I think that really gives that insight into that question. Now I've got a question for Phoebe and Carla. Have either of you considered doing a postgraduate degree, either in the US or in the UK? And I can start with Phoebe.
Yes, I definitely have. And I think I would like to do a PhD in political science in the US. I think I'm going to go home first and then come back and do that. But I would say for Bryn Mawr, I can't speak for the other women's colleges, but Bryn Mawr is really a feeder for graduate school. And I would say the majority of students that go there will go on to get a graduate degree. And they really do set you up to write a thesis, potentially get your thesis published, have really close relationships with professors so you can get good recommendations. And so, yeah, and Bryn Mawr actually has a grad school. It's a co-ed grad school, which I think is quite unique for a women's college. But yes, I do want to do postgrad, and women's colleges set you up very well to pursue that track.
Yeah, I would agree. That's definitely something I've considered. I considered doing a PhD in French for a while. I'm going into law for a while. So it's definitely something that I think I see in my future. I'm not sure where it will be. I'm not sure when it will be. But yeah, I would agree that the representation that you see in a women's college, you see your fellow students or even graduates who maybe graduated a couple of years ahead of you. You see them go on to do their postgrads in so many different areas. So I think it's definitely something that as a women's college student, you definitely not exactly expected of you, but it's definitely something that seems feasible and exciting to do in the future.
Great. We have a question. I'll ask this to Professor Moseby. Are the majority of professors or leaders at women's colleges women as well, or does it vary according to the university?
I think it varies, but I think Mount Holyoke in many ways looks like a number of other women's colleges in the United States. So for us, about 60% of our faculty are women or identify as women, and the majority of our senior leadership at the college are also women. And so I know that that hasn't always been the case. But certainly in terms of representation and demonstrating women's leadership, I think it's important for a women's college to have women in key leadership positions.
Absolutely. Great. A question now for Phoebe and Carla. Do you think that you have missed out on anything by going to a women's college by comparison to attending a co-ed institution?
That's a good question. A lot of people will ask that, and I last year I interviewed incoming Barnard students who were interested in joining the college and who were going through the application, and so a lot of their questions were about like, do you feel like you've missed out on anything? Do you still feel as though you get to interact with boys? Do you still feel as though you get to meet boys? And I mean Barnard's a little bit of a different situation because we're like an undergrad college within Columbia, and Columbia is a co-ed institution, but yeah, we still get opportunities to obviously mix with guys in our classes. Barnard students can register at Columbia classes, and Columbia students can register at Barnard classes. Our extracurriculars are mixed, and even women's colleges who aren't in that position of having like being in one undergrad institution within a bigger university. I think there are still, and probably Professor Moseby can speak more to this, but I think at most women's colleges, there's some kind of partnership with other universities. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've gained more than I've lost anything. I majored at Haverford College, so I spent a lot of time there. I got a boyfriend. He went to Swarthmore, so it is possible. And I think for Bryn Mawr in particular, because we have the Trico consortium and the Quaker consortium, we have access to all of those professors, their libraries, their classes, everything. But then you also get to be part of the smaller Bryn Mawr community, and it's really, you can pick and choose how big or small you want your experience to be. So no, I definitely don't think I've missed out on anything.
And I would add, thinking about Mount Holyoke, we are part of a 5-college consortium, and 2 of the 5 colleges are women's colleges. So, Mount Holyoke and Smith up the road, along with Amherst, Hampshire, and the University of Massachusetts. So it's really, I always see it as, the experience is what a student makes it to be. So if a student really wants to, sort of get off campus and go, enjoy the social scene, that's a possibility. But also if one is much more in tune with being in the library, that's also open to you as well. And so really the experience is what you make it. And I think there's a whole range of opportunities and options to choose from.
Perfect. Another question for Phoebe and Carla. How well known are women's colleges here in the UK? And obviously, do you have any sense of perhaps how that would translate to a UK job market or something like that if you were to come back here to the UK after your studies?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that was something I think I was aware of when I came into Barnard. I knew that I was giving up opportunities to go to like brand name universities in the UK in order to go to Barnard. So that was definitely something that I knew going in. And I think, yeah, Barnard's name is probably not that well known in the UK. If you go to an employer, then it's unlikely that they will know Barnard. Obviously, Barnard is part of Columbia, as I said, so people generally are more likely to know that name. But I think the important thing is that because women's colleges have such a strong alumni network, And because you're able to have so much, you're able to get so many positions that way, that I don't think the fact that Barnard is not that well known in the UK has been a hindrance to me at all. You know, when you're going to apply to a job, the name of your university is probably not the most important thing to an employer. And I think because I've been able to make the most of Barnard's alumni network and just its network of professors and other students, the experiences that I've had at Barnard carry a lot more weight than the name of the university does.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Carla just said. And a good example of the alumni network working for you, I just participated in an alumni event for Bryn Mawr, and the speaker was Baroness Northover, who is in the House of Lords, and she went to Bryn Mawr. And so the experiences in the alumni network is really what is going to carry you. And honestly, people in the UK don't know most of the major ones in the US anyway. So even if you went to like Brown or somewhere like that, people probably won't even know what that is. So yeah, focusing more on the connections you make, the network that you make, and your experiences, studying abroad, internships, that's what's going to help you in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really shone through with your introductions, that sense of all of those incredible internship opportunities and other opportunities like that you've been able to dive right into as part of your undergraduate study is really something that is quite unique to US liberal arts colleges, and that, you know, even that sort of boldness of going to study in another country at the age of just 18 is going to really be attractive to many UK employers who are often citing international experience as a really positive trait in their applicants. Professor Moseby, we have a couple of questions coming through for you, if that's okay. The first is, would you be able to speak to some of the funding that are available at the postgraduate level for UK students in the US? And I'm happy to add anything on more generally to that as well. So if you want to start off with that, and I'll come back for the second question.
I would say, you know, based on my own sort of, you know, experience, is that it often looks very similar to the funding opportunities for undergraduate students. So there's often a mixture of grants, loans, perhaps even work study as well. And it really just depends on the institution. I also saw that there is a question about, you know, are admissions open for mature students as well? And I would say yes. At Mount Holyoke College, also Smith College, and I imagine at others, we have a program that's open for students who are non-traditional age. So at Mount Holyoke, we call it the Francis Perkins program. At Smith College, it's called the Ada Comstock Scholars, and I encourage you to check them out.
Great, and you answered that second question beautifully without me even needing to ask. If you are a mature student, or if you are looking to pursue postgraduate study in the US and have questions about funding or anything like that, again, we at EducationUSA are more than happy to provide support on that, so don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We have a question for you, Carla, about Barnard. Is Barnard only an undergraduate college? And where do students from Barnard go on if they want to do a master's or a PhD program?
Yeah, so yes, Barnard is only an undergraduate institution. Students go all over for grad school and for PhD programs and all of that. I think specifically for Barnard, because it's part of Columbia University, a lot of students will go on to get second degrees from Columbia, just because it's so close and they already are familiar with New York, familiar with the university. A lot of students will go on and do that, but students really go all over the US and also back in their home countries or other places abroad.
Great. I just have a couple. I think we've gotten to all of the questions so far in the Q&A box. So if you do have additional questions, please feel free to pop those in so that we can get to them before the end of this session. But I just had a couple of questions for Phoebe and Carla, reflecting on your experiences, because Carla, you are in your final semester And Phoebe, you have obviously just graduated from not only a women's college, but also a liberal arts college in the US. Would you both be able to kind of share some overall reflections about your time, maybe some of your top highlights, what was challenging to you going as a UK student to the US, and what is something that you would like to have known sort of 4 or 5 years ago as you were going into this process that you'd share with British students who are walking in your shoes? I know that's a lot of questions thrown into one, so don't feel like you have to answer straight away. You can have a minute to think.
Well, I'll take the first question about a memorable experience. So as I said, in my sophomore year, I worked at the French Embassy in New York, and the reason that I got that job was through a contact with one of my professors who I was really close to over the summer. I then worked on a translation project for her, and then she introduced me to this internship at the embassy. So already I was able to get that position because of the professor who I had at the university and the contact that I had with her. So that's like the first thing to say, is that basically this story is just an example of how close connections at whichever college you end up at are really important further down the line. Because then I was at the embassy and I was on a lunch break one day, and I heard this voice behind me, and it was one of the girls from my French classes who's also a Barnard student. So that was really exciting to have another Barnard student in this embassy, which was like a dream place to work for me, but also seemed like a really intimidating big organization. So it was great to have someone also from Barnard who was there. And then so we got talking, and I was at another event. It was like an awards ceremony for one of the ambassadors, and one of the ladies who I got speaking to was actually that other student's boss, and she ended up being a graduate of Barnard. So that was just another example of how you go to this really small university. Barnard has 600 students in a grade, but then you go out into these big institutions in New York or in whichever city you're in, or even internationally, and you see that actually those connections that you've built at Barnard and that tight-knit network really carries to these big organizations that you go to. So yeah, that's a little anecdote.
I think there's so many memorable moments, but I think I started college in the fall of 2016 during the 2016 election. And obviously having Hillary Clinton as the candidate, there was a lot of buzz on campus. And so we got a lot of attention, and especially being in Philly, I got to see Barack Obama speak, Bill Clinton. I got to see Hillary Clinton speak multiple times. And it was just so exciting to be in that sort of kind of electric environment. I also, when I was interning in DC, which I got through the Bryn Mawr Summer Funding Program, I got to have dinner with David Lammy, who's my favorite MP ever. So that was really awesome. And I've just found myself in all these situations. I'm like, I can't believe that I am here, and this is like what I'm doing. Like, I'm surrounded by all these people. Like, I don't really know how I got here, but it's like I'm fine with it because this is great. And then I would also, on another point you just said, Holly, I think it's small, but it's really important. But I learned to write really, really well at Bryn Mawr. And I wasn't really aware of how important that was, because I think in the UK, we're very, we do a lot of standardized exams, standardized tests, and you don't really learn how to write well. And I thought, going into policy, you don't really need to write, it's all data and statistics. I write every single day in my job. And the reason I got hired was because I write really well. And so having that skill, and also data is important, computer science is important, but going to liberal arts and being able to just write and articulate your thoughts is so important in whatever field that you go into. So I'm really grateful for that.
Great. Thank you both. We've had a couple more questions in the chat. So if the three of you are available just for a couple of more minutes to go through those, I'm happy to answer those, because we don't want to leave anything unanswered if we can. A question here for Phoebe and Carla again. Were you able to travel back to the UK at all during your 4 years? And if so, how often?
So I tend to go back every summer and every winter break. So summer is usually about 3 months. And I usually spend some of that in New York, or some of that in the US, and some of it in the UK. And then winter break, I usually spend at home. Obviously with coronavirus, that looked a little bit different, because I ended up coming home for most of the pandemic last year, and then came back to New York in August. So that changes things a little bit, but hopefully you all won't be dealing with that when you end up in US universities. But yeah, that's how I generally did it.
Yeah, I went home every winter break, and then summers, the first summer I went home, the second summer I was studying abroad in Australia, and then the third summer I was interning in the US, so I only went home for a few weeks. And obviously the pandemic, I was saying to Carla before, I've been here since January 2020 and able to go back. But that's unusual. Usually people go at least once or twice a year, and my parents actually came out and visited me as well, so that was nice.
Yeah. Great. A question for Professor Moseby. How do STEM programs, you spoke a little bit about women in STEM in your presentation, how do STEM programs at women's colleges compare to those of other institutions? How are they recognized? Are there any key differences to be aware of?
I think it's an interesting question, because our STEM programs are wonderful. Oftentimes they're as good as or better. And also the opportunities that students have to work in labs, I think, is a key difference. So a student who majors in STEM, they have many opportunities to work with faculty members on different research projects, with faculty in their labs, and also to publish alongside their faculty members. And so very often co-ed institutions do not always provide that type of opportunity for students, and also may not be as in tune or engaged in the issues of equity in terms of who has access to a professor, who has access to their lab, who is going to get selected to work in any given faculty member's lab. And so what we find sometimes at co-ed institutions, some of the women get shut out of these opportunities, these really key opportunities, to apply for, to be in a lab, which also sets them up very well for graduate school. And so my response is that I think really, if one is interested in STEM, one place to really look is at a women's college. There's a special connection with faculty members, and those faculty members will give you a leg up in terms of recommendations, that will set you up very well for graduate work, and also for med school as well. Med school, veterinary school, what have you.
Great. Thank you for that. We have got time for just one more question, because I know we are running over slightly. And so if you do have additional questions that you'd like to ask to us, please don't hesitate, as I say, to get in touch with us at EducationUSA, and I'll put our email address in the chat. The final question is for Phoebe and Carla, and it was just about how did you find that transition, casting your mind back from moving from the UK to the US when you first moved out, and how did your college sort of support you and help you in that transition?
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said it was easy. It was a culture shock that I wasn't really expecting, because I think you think the UK and the US are kind of similar. They are not. They're very different. I think the academics were tough to get to grips with at first, because it's a continual assessment. You always have things due, you always have things that, projects, exams, and everything's very holistic. And I'd been used to the A-levels and just studying for end of year exams. So getting used to that kind of constant pressure all the time was challenging. Also, if you go to US University, you'll know that everybody is busy all the time, and everybody has like a million things on their plate. So that was kind of overwhelming. I had been like that in A-levels, but like not to the extent that people in the US are like that. But I would say for Bryn Mawr, my freshman year roommates, one was from China, one was from India, and one was from Pakistan. And having that kind of international community of people who also feel like they have no idea what they're doing and also feel overwhelmed was really nice. And I think now, especially with the Set Interest program, even if you don't go through that program, there's so many alumni that are at US universities, and being a UK low-income student is a very specific category that not a lot of people understand. So if you do feel like that, I would recommend reaching out to the Set Interest Alumni Network, because even if you're not in the program, they understand what you're going through and will be happy to help you out.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Phoebe said. And I think that's why it's important when you choose a college to choose somewhere that's going to be a good fit for you, because in the first weeks and the first months, you feel alienated because you're in a new country. Everyone feels really different to you. And I would totally echo what Phoebe said about everyone being busy all of the time. That's definitely something I found at Barnard. Some things that helped me coming in were just the people I had around me. I made really good friends with the other girls on my floor, and that's something I feel really grateful for, and I'm still really close with them now. I think other things, so Phoebe mentioned the network of other UK students who will also be in the US. That's something that's really important. I know I started, we co-founded a netball club at Columbia, and US students don't have any idea what netball means, but obviously that's something that's been it was a really important part of, you know, we all did that in PE, all the girls learned netball growing up, so having a netball team was really fun, and I was able to share that with my US friends and be like, oh, this is what we learn at home. And so we like coach the team every week, we had a little tournament, but just doing those kind of things and making sure that you have people around you who you can reach out to, making sure you still call your family at home, or that kind of stuff helps. But yeah, there's always going to be an adjustment period.
Okay, I thank you both so much for answering that question. I think that is all we have time for this evening, because we are going slightly over. So thank you all for sticking with us. I just want to say a huge thank you to Professor Moseby and Phoebe and Carla for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure to hear all of your wisdom and experiences about what it's like to be involved and be a student at a women's college. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day or evening, wherever it is that you are at the moment. Take care. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.